Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. First thing I want to check is video and audio. If you can hear me and you can see me, go ahead and put a yes in the chat. Nice. Next thing, this is one of my favorite parts of every webinar we do. If you'll go ahead and put your location and your industry in the chat box. I love seeing these. Location and industry in the chat box. We got Tucson, software, Mexico, medical devices, Reston, home building, Philippines, insurance, Calgary, tax, Jacksonville, Montreal, Belgium, China,
wow.
Edmonton. I love doing this.
Ecuador,
Cleveland,
Manchester, UK,
Brazil, Brighton, UK, India. This is awesome.
Glasgow,
This is
Scotland.
You guys are from everywhere. This is great. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started by just clearing up a few housekeeping items. So first thing I want to mention, looks like you guys are pros. You've got the chat box. One distinction I want to make is when you see the 2 in your chat box, it'll say all panelists or all panelists and attendees. You want to make sure that that says all panelists and attendees if you want it to show up for everybody. If you want to talk to just us, put panelists. My name's Junior. I'm a manager of client services here at LeaderFactor, and I'll be participating in the webinar as kind of a moderator. I'll be looking in the chat and you can interact with us there. So if you have any questions, you can ping me in there. Another thing I want to mention before everybody asks is we will record this session and it will be sent out probably at the beginning of next week. And this is the 4th webinar in this series of the 4 stages of psychological safety. If you've missed the other 3 and you'd like to watch them, they're on our YouTube channel. So if you search LeaderFactor in YouTube, you'll see recordings of the prior 3 webinars where we talk about inclusion, learner, and contributor safety, the first 3 stages of psychological safety. Next thing I want to mention is we have a giveaway today. We've been doing giveaways in all these webinars. They've been pretty popular, so we're going to do another one. This one has probably the best prize out of all of the ones we've done so far. This is going to be a 30-minute live virtual session with Dr. Clark and just your team doing a summary of the 4 stages of psychological safety. So to enter, what you're going to do is post on LinkedIn at the end of this webinar your experience with the webinar, tag us, LeaderFactor, and put hashtag psychological safety. I'll put those instructions in the chat, but that's a great way to get this content out to more people. And in return, we would love to give one of you a session. We'll select that randomly. And then to 10 of you, we'll give a free digital copy of the book. We've done that before and it's been great. So if you haven't had a chance to read the book, now's your chance to get it for free. So with that, we'll jump into the webinar and I'll introduce the topic and a little bit about our host today, Dr. Timothy Clark. So today's webinar is the 4th in the 4 stages series, and we're going to be talking about stage 4 challenger safety, making it safe to challenge the status quo. It's a fascinating topic. It's especially timely and relevant today. And this webinar series is based on the book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, which came out in March of this year. It's relatively new. You can get it anywhere books are sold. And with that, Tim, will you advance the slide and we'll go over to your bio. So today, hosting today's webinar, we've got Dr. Timothy Clark. He's an Oxford-trained social scientist who's been doing research and instrument design in this space for several decades now. And he's the CEO and founder of LeaderFactor. So Tim, with that, I'll let you take it away. I think you're muted. That mute button's a stickler.
There we go. Are we on? We
Perfect.
made it. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining us. We're delighted to have you. And we really do have a global audience today. And we're excited to be with you to talk about what, as Junior said, a very relevant and timely topic. How do you make it safe to challenge the status quo? So the agenda today, we've got five 5 elements that we'd like to cover. We'll review the 4 stages framework, the 4 stages of psychological safety, and then we're going to focus on stage 4, which is challenger safety. And this is the culminating stage. And we'll talk about why it is so difficult to achieve and maintain, and yet why it's so vitally important. And then we'll talk about the social exchange that happens in that stage. What does that look like? We'll talk about intellectual and social friction and what we have to do to nurture psychological safety with those 2 forces at work. And then I'm going to give you 3 global best practices to create an environment that nurtures and cultivates challenger safety. So let's dig in and let's go through the 4 stages framework briefly. The basic definition of psychological safety is that it's not expensive to be yourself in a social setting, any social setting. And when I say expensive, I mean socially, emotionally, economically, politically. If it is expensive, what do? So put your responses in your chat box. If it is expensive to be yourself in a social setting, what do human beings do?
I'll start reading these as they come in. Change or leave. We try to adapt, comply, we stay quiet, we withdraw. Avoidance, we stop being ourselves, we don't do anything.
We do nothing.
Fight or flight.
Yeah.
We water ourselves down. I like that a lot. We conform to the norm, look down, camouflage, feel insecure, get anxious, be someone else. Be good.
Wonderful insights. And it confirms the empirical research that we have on this issue. The bottom line is, when a human goes into a social setting and feels that it's expensive to be himself or herself, we change. We change our behavior in order to manage personal risk. We go into a mode of loss prevention and self-preservation, and that's a very normal thing to do. Let me give you a fuller definition of psychological safety. There's much more depth to this concept. So here it is. Psychological safety means that you can do 4 things. Number 1, be included. And that's always number 1. That's the foundation. Number 2, you have to feel safe to learn. 3, safe to contribute. And then 4, and finally, safe to challenge the status quo. And you need to be able to do these things without fear of being embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. Now, let me show you this graphically illustrated. Here's what it looks like. Psychological safety is a function of 2 dimensions. We have respect on the vertical axis, and we have permission on the horizontal axis. It's a fusion of these 2 dimensions. And there's a progression to psychological safety. It's not a binary proposition. It's not something that you have or you don't have. It's a matter of degree. And the sequence is universal. It doesn't matter the culture or the demographics or the industry. Those things they don't matter. The sequence is universal. So we begin with inclusion safety, and then we go to learner safety, and then contributor, and then finally challenger. This pattern follows the sequence of natural human needs. So let me give you a little bit more detail here, a little bit more complexity to explain a couple of things. So, and I'll get my highlighter out. Here we go. Okay. So we begin in a state of exclusion where respect and permission are very low. But then we cross over, and we call this the threshold of inclusion. And this takes us into stage 1, which is inclusion safety. Inclusion safety is our foundation. It's where we begin this journey. So you can see we cross the threshold, and then we come to inclusion safety, and then we move to, that's our foundation. And inclusion safety means that we feel included, we are accepted, there's a sense of belonging. And that is always the foundation because that's the first stage of human need. And then we progress to learner safety. Learner safety means that we're able to engage in the learning process. We can ask questions, we can give and receive feedback, we can experiment, we can even make mistakes, and we're not going to be punished for that. We're not going to have negative consequences for that. We're not going to have retaliation. After we learn, what is the next natural human instinct and desire? It's to use, it's to apply what we learn. It's to make a difference. It's to be able to participate in that value creation process. That is contributor safety, which is the next stage. That's stage 3. And you can see that levels of respect and permission are elevating. So the overall trust level in the social unit is going up. Then we cross over what we call the innovation threshold. And that moves us to challenger safety, which is the culminating stage, the highest stage. Challenger safety is the highest stage because our level of personal exposure and vulnerability are also at the highest level. And so therefore we need the highest possible level of psychological safety to protect us if we're going to engage in these acts of vulnerability to challenge the status quo. Challenging the status quo is a scary thing to do. And often we feel that we're going to jeopardize our career, our standing, our reputation. And so that's what we're talking about today. And so we want to talk a little bit more and go into some more depth about this. Okay, so let's do that. Here we go. Here's a question. How do you know it's safe to challenge the status quo? What indicators are you looking at? Go ahead and use your chat box and let's get some discussion and dialogue going. What do you look for to know if it's safe to challenge the status quo?
We've got no punishment. You've seen others do it and it was received well. You have a receptive audience. You're invited explicitly. There are others that are doing it already. A mature boss invites the dialogue in meetings, a supportive environment. You're not judged. When the role leaders are doing it, collective understanding that the status quo isn't working, leaders' responses from the past. If we're not laughed at or degraded, there's space to innovate and openness to different perspectives. There's an appreciation, an environment of lively debate when others model it, seeing appreciation for contributions made through challenging ideas. It's rewarded, it's an expectation, it's part of the mission. When leaders ask for feedback, constructive conflict, you're good.
Okay, so what we realize is that human beings have a very well developed capacity to sense if they have permission to challenge the status quo, if these acts of vulnerability will be punished or rewarded. And so they're going to be monitoring the environment. They're going to be doing threat detection on an ongoing basis. This is what we do as human beings. Let's talk about innovation, because at the level of challenger safety, this is where we innovate. So let's try to understand innovation a little bit better. Innovation is a team sport. It's something that is based on social interaction. Now, occasionally, it's a light bulb moment of lone genius. Sometimes someone will think of something brilliant all by themselves, but this is the exception. So here's how it usually happens. It happens through what we call recombination. We connect things that are not normally connected. How do we do that? We do it as we're talking and we're in dialogue and conversation. We do it through what we call divergent or lateral or associative or nonlinear thinking. we take new or existing knowledge and we combine it with other pieces of new or existing knowledge, and we see if there's new value that comes out of it. Now, most of the time, this recombination process, this collaboration that we do, most of the time, it fails. It doesn't work. But occasionally, it does work. And that's how we innovate. So innovation at its very root is a social process. And we engage in this recombination through these skills and through this kind of dialogue. This is how we innovate. But here's an interesting thing. When we do survey research and we ask employees, is innovation part of your job? Guess what percent, I want you to go to your chat box and try to answer this question. What percent of employees across the board believe that innovation is part of their job? What do you think?
12%. Okay. Jeff, that was very specific. 10%, 5%, 2%.
Yeah.
Low numbers. Low numbers.
Now, there are several surveys that have been done that have asked this question, and the highest that we see, the highest is 20%. And some go as low as 5%, but the highest is 20. So what does that mean? That means that the vast majority of employees across the board don't think that innovation is part of their jobs. Now, why don't they think that innovation is part of their jobs? I would argue that innovation is embedded in every job because we only do two things in organizations. We do execution and we do innovation. Execution is delivering value today. Innovation is figuring out how we're going to deliver value tomorrow. But that's really all we do in organizations. We deliver value today, execution, and we try to figure out how to deliver value tomorrow, innovation. So really, if you think about it, everyone should be involved in both of those processes, and yet 80% of people don't think innovation is part of their job. So if you ask them whose job is innovation, what do they say? Whose job is it? Who do they point to? What do you think?
The boss.
It's the boss. It's R&D. It's senior leadership. It's those guys. That's what people say. Instead of, oh, no, that's part of my job. Now, here's part of the problem based on the research that we've done. When people think of innovation, they are misconceiving of the concept. Let me explain it to you this way. There are two types of innovation. Type 1 is incremental and derivative. Incremental means small steps. Derivative means it's based on and built on what we are already doing, right? So small steps that are based on what we have already done or are doing. That's type 1. Type 2 is radical and disruptive. Type 2 is the big stuff. It's the cutting edge stuff. It's the very risky stuff. So most people in their heads, when they think of the word innovation, they automatically think of type 2 innovation. And then they say, that doesn't include me. So they take themselves out of the equation. When the reality is, here's the ratio. 99% of the innovation that we do in organizations is type 1. Only 1% is type 2. So people are taking themselves out of it. They don't think they're smart enough. They don't think it's part of their job because they're thinking about type 2. So when you explain the real nature of innovation, what does it do? It disarms them. It makes them realize, oh, innovation is part of my job. You see the difference? And this is part of what we need to be teaching in organizations today. We need to bring people in to the innovation process and help them understand that this is part of your job. And by the way, you don't need to be a genius to participate. You can participate in a meaningful way in the innovation process. But then it becomes our job to create the culture that allows that to happen. Let's talk about what we call the social exchange for Challenger safety. The social exchange is very simple. Here it is. The social exchange for Challenger safety is that the organization, the leader, provides air cover in exchange for your candor. So it's air cover in exchange for candor. If you give me the air cover, if you protect me in my vulnerability, in challenging the status quo, I will give you candor. I will engage in hard-hitting dialogue. I will put challenging ideas on the table. I will engage in constructive dissent and creative abrasion. But if the air cover's not there, then I'm going to back off. This is the unwritten social exchange that governs stage 4 Challenger safety. So if you're in a leadership position, then it is your stewardship to provide the air cover. If you don't provide the air cover, but you ask people for candor, what's the problem with that? That's disingenuous. Don't even ask, because people are going to look around and they're going to say, hang on a second, it's not safe. Why are you even asking me that? So that's a disingenuous invitation. But it's our job as leaders to provide that air cover. Let's talk about this a little bit more. Let's talk about intellectual and social friction and how these two forces work together. Now, let me explain the role of a leader in creating Challenger safety this way. The leader's job is to do two things simultaneously. And this is not easy, but this is the mark of a very effective leader. Number one, increase intellectual friction. What does that mean? That means that we have hard-hitting dialogue. We have debate. Ideas are colliding. We have constructive dissent. People are not holding back. This is intellectual friction. Why do we need it? It's only through intellectual friction that we solve problems, that we come up with new solutions, that we innovate. Innovation is based on intellectual friction. That's the raw material for innovation. But here's the problem. When intellectual friction goes up, social friction also has a tendency to go up as well. Why is that? Why does social friction go up when intellectual friction goes up? Go to your text box and let's talk about this for a minute. Why does the social friction have a tendency to go up when the intellectual friction is going up?
Jeff says the stakes are higher. Bob says ego. Susan, risk of looking stupid. People take ideas personally.
They
Different
do.
views, different frameworks. Some people are jealous. I can't keep up with these. People are
Excellent.
siloed. Relationships are at stake. Emotions get involved. Poor conflict skills. We can't separate ideas from emotional connection. I like
Right.
that. Inferiority, different life experiences, political correctness.
Excellent insights. So we understand this, and this becomes quite a challenge. But here's what happens. If the leader allows the social friction to keep rising as the intellectual friction rises, at some point the social friction will block the intellectual friction and shut it down. And so the effective leader is managing this carefully and effectively, managing the social friction down while the intellectual friction goes up. How do you do that? Now, there are many, many behaviors and skills that contribute to doing that. And I'm going to give you 3 global best practices at the end of the webinar. But we have to patrol the boundaries of respect. Leaders, you can't allow personal attacks. You can't allow it to become personal. Now, we're human, and so humans are very sensitive. So the emotions get involved quickly, the ego gets involved, and it's the leader's job to maintain those respectful terms of engagement. That is so critical. And then the other thing that we often see, right, is when the leader himself or herself gets defensive, the leader is invested in the status quo, gets defensive, and the leader is escalating in social friction. Now we're in big trouble. So you can see that the leader is the linchpin. The leader plays this pivotal role to keep the social friction down as the intellectual friction is going up. So that's the framework that we use to explain the leader's job in creating and nurturing challenger safety. Now we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that, but that's the framework that we use. Hopefully that's helpful to you. If we do this consistently, then in the culture, we are able to promote a pattern of what we call intellectual bravery. And this is most essential for innovation. Intellectual bravery is a willingness to disagree, dissent, or challenge the status quo in a setting where there's some social, emotional, political, and economic risk. The point is that you've reduced the risk way down. There will always be some. You can't go to zero. But the effective leader manages it way down so that it becomes acceptable to people and they can weigh in, and they're not going to be worried that I'm staking my career on this. I'm taking this intolerable risk. They're not going to think that, and they're going to feel safe enough to challenge the status quo. Okay, so let's go into how do you create this level of psychological safety. Let's get a little bit more specific with some what we have identified as global best practices. Here's number one. Global best practice number one, formally assign dissent. Well, what do I mean? This concept is not new. Some organizations do it exceedingly well. Most organizations don't do it well at all. In fact, most organizations don't even do it. So we use names for this concept. So in the world of IT, we use the word or the term white hat hacking. What does it mean to white hat hack? It means that you take your own people in IT security and you say, try to break in to our security systems, try to break into our systems, see if you can break them, see if you can penetrate them, see if you can get in. Why do we do that? So the white hat means that you're friendly. So why do we do that to ourselves? Because we want to see where we are vulnerable. We want to see where we have flaws. We want to see where we're weak. We want to see where we may break down. That is extremely valuable information. That's how we get better. That's how we innovate. So we do this in the world of IT. We do tiger teams. NASA developed tiger teams in the 1950s. A tiger team is formally assigned to take a piece of technology, a process, and try to break it. Try to shoot holes in it. Try to find the flaws and the weaknesses, right? Because we don't want to operationalize something unless we are absolutely sure that it's going to work. In Silicon Valley, we use red teams. A red team is very similar. We take a piece of programming. We take some functionality that we think we have debugged. And we say, okay, red team, see if you can break this. See if you can find holes. See if you can find the flaws. So that's what we do. We also use terms like pre and mid-mortem, loyal opposition, devil's advocate. But here's the main point. The best practice is to assign team members to take a dissenting position from the beginning. And the reason that this is so important that you assign dissent formally from the beginning is because if you do this, then the individuals can trade personal risk for institutional permission. If you say, hey, Tim, I want you to take a dissenting position on this new product idea. If I'm formally assigned to do that, then you have effectively taken away my sense of personal risk, or at least most of it, and you've replaced it with institutional permission. If you can make that trade, you will be astonished at how people will jump in and challenge the status quo, because essentially you're saying, we're giving you air cover. So now let's have the candor. So that is global best practice number one. Okay. Let's go to number two. Global best practice number two is to apply the disruption question sequence. So let's think about how we innovate. So there are two kinds of inquiry that we use in organizations. One is explanatory inquiry. Explanatory inquiry explains what's happening and what happened in the past. We're trying to understand cause and effect relationships. And so we take things apart. We do root cause analysis. This is explanatory inquiry. The other kind of inquiry is exploratory inquiry. Exploratory inquiry is about the future. So what could we do? What is possible? What should we explore? And so global best practice number two is to invite and train your people to apply the disruption question sequence. It has three parts. You begin with a why question. The why question activates the process. So why do we do it this way? Why do we have this process in our customer service, for example? And then part number two is, what if we tried something else? What if we tried this or that? And then element number three is, how might we do that? Let's think about how we possibly could do that. This disruption question sequence is the heart of innovation. And it's really what fuels our ability to engage in divergent thinking and challenge the status quo. But it takes some training, it takes some practice, and it takes some modeling on the part of leaders. People don't just normally or naturally jump into it unless A, it's being modeled for them, and B, they see that people are protected when they're doing it. Right? So this is the disruption question sequence. Number one, ask a why question. Number two, ask a what if question. And then number three, ask a how question. And by the way, when you do this, you make it clear to your people that we have no limitations. So we are going to act as if we have no limitations, no constraints, at least for the sake of our thinking exercise right now. Now, of course, we operate under constraints, but we're going to try to take those limitations away to unleash and liberate our thinking during this exercise. So that's global best practice number two, apply the disruption question sequence. Let's go to number three. Global best practice number three is to emotionally separate from the status quo. Now, this is not easy to do. This is really not easy to do. And leaders struggle with this. What this requires is superb emotional intelligence. Your emotional intelligence is your delivery system. So I want you to think about your IQ as representing all of your skills, your knowledge, your experience. And your EQ is your delivery system. Your EQ delivers your IQ in the broad sense. If your delivery system is underdeveloped, if your delivery system is broken, you're not going to be able to do this. So first of all, we've got to work on emotional intelligence as our delivery system. Controlled ego, that's part of it. Humility is extremely important, because without humility, we go into a state of willful blindness. We're not listening. We're talking, we're not listening. We cut off the flow and the circulation of local knowledge that comes to us from our people. So without humility, we move to a state of arrogance and hubris, and that is an occupational hazard. So we've got to maintain the humility, because humility gives us clarity. Humility keeps the local knowledge in circulation. And then finally, the capacity to accommodate dissent. And I mean that emotionally. Can you handle dissent? Can you handle bad news? What are your people going to be looking at? They're going to be looking at your emotional response to bad news. Your emotional response is the most powerful signal that you're sending to your people. So if you can accommodate the dissent, then they're going to say, I'm getting air cover, so I can give you candor. But if you're not accommodating the dissent, then they're going to say, no air cover, no candor, so I'm going to back off. Okay, now this is a start. Let me ask you to add some suggestions here, some practical, concrete behaviors. So what else can we do to provide the air cover and emotionally separate from the status quo? What else have you seen that works for you and for your people? What are some other behaviors?
Ask before speaking. Focus on the process, not the people involved. Keep the end goal in mind. Jason says leverage humor. Daniel says awareness of your own emotions in real time. Transparency, high EQ, be objective with your own ideas. Remember empathy, encourage new ideas. These are good.
Excellent.
I've got a few more coming in here. Understand before being understood. Pause and have a go-to phrase like that's interesting. Critical thinking, talk about your feelings, appoint a referee. A leader recognizes his own flaws. Ability of the leader to actively listen in the speaker's wavelength. Understand that perfection is not the goal. Give yourself grace. Don't be addicted to being right.
Okay. Don't be addicted to being right.
Make owners part of the improvement. Have conversational rituals. Create a space for free thinking. As if we were designing from scratch, what would we create? Yeah. Acknowledge all contributions. Pause before responding. Make things tangible. These are good.
Mm-hmm. So you can see the patterns. What we're trying to create is a culturally flat organization where people are not hiding behind title, position, or authority, where the status hierarchy does not become this great obstacle, where positional power is neutralized. And who neutralizes it? Those who have it. They have to do that themselves. This is so critical. Okay, so let me kind of conclude and by saying or by outlining the way that we shift a culture to increase psychological safety and hopefully go all the way to stage 4 to challenger safety, where we can innovate. So your stewardship and my stewardship is to be the cultural architect of our workplaces. This is our job. This is the job to be done. How do cultures form and reform? Number one, a pattern of thought or behavior in a person is a habit. And then that grows, and a pattern of thought or behavior in a team becomes a norm. So now this is a shared habit. We call that a norm. Finally, step 3, a collection of norms in an organization becomes a culture. This is the way that it happens. And so our job is to be that cultural architect, and we begin with ourselves to nurture and foster psychological safety by the concrete behaviors that we are modeling each and every day. And then we can shift the norms, the prevailing norms on a team or an organization in order to elevate psychological safety and get it up to stage 4 challenger safety. Increase intellectual friction, reduce social friction. Okay, with that, let's do a little bit of Q&A. But first, let's talk about a couple of things that we have coming up and the giveaways, and then I'll spend a little bit of time with everyone, and let's do a little bit of Q&A.
Excellent. So a couple things we have on the radar that we want you to be aware of. Tim, I think it's on the next slide. We've got a subsequent webinar coming up on August 7th, how to measure psychological safety. That is the magic question. It's been a question in this space for a long time, and we're pretty sure we have the answer at this point. So we'd like you to join us, and we'll tell you how. So I will go ahead and put this link in the chat right now for you to register for this next webinar. There it is. Next, we have a certification. So we've started to do these certifications this year on the 4 stages of psychological safety. So what this is access to the 4 stages team survey platform, which we'll talk a little bit more about during the webinar on August 7th. And this allows you to facilitate the 4 stages content. The 4 stages framework gives you all of the facilitator materials to deliver on-site or virtual workshops. So a lot of cool things we have going on with the cert. These are limited spots. We keep them to about 15, and we've got 5 spots left for the 21st. So if you want to go to leaderfactor.com/certifications, that will give you all of the information that you need to learn more about what that is, and it will give you all of the registration links and things like that. The 4 Stages app we'll talk a little bit more about during the webinar, but this is our online platform that uses the 4 Stages framework to measure a team's psychological safety and then give the manager of that team 3 recommendations for their top 3 opportunities. We can track psych safety over time. It's a really neat platform that was released in tandem with the book this year that's been highly successful so far. Excellent. So with that, Q&A. So if you want to throw your questions into the chat, I'll moderate that. Now's your chance.
Yeah, let's do a little Q&A.
Okay, Bob says, how do we challenge emotionally immature leaders? That's a golden question.
It is really a tough question, because if the leader is emotionally immature, then oftentimes that leader will take it out on you. And so what you're going to have to do, and we all do this, is you're going to have to run a risk-reward calculation in your head. And we do this all the time, right? We're doing threat detection all the time in social settings. And you're either going to get to a place where you think you can challenge and you're going to be okay, or you're going to conclude that you cannot do it and you're going to leave the team or the organization. I guess a third option is that you're going to take a very high risk and you're going to see what happens. And sometimes we do that, right? Now, here's an interesting pattern that we're seeing. If you are an individual that is very confident and you have a high level of self-efficacy, you will typically challenge even in an environment where the psychological safety is not that high. You'll take a bigger risk than other people because of your skills, confidence, and sense of self-efficacy. But here's what we know based on the research. Most people will not muscle through the fear. They need an environment where they do have the air cover. And so even though there may be a few that will, we have to remember that if we're running an organization and we're the architect of the culture, we're the curator of the culture, we cannot expect people to muscle through the fear. They're not going to do that. They're going to withdraw and they're going to manage personal risk. They're going to shift to a defensive mode of performance rather than an offensive mode of performance. right?
Excellent. Before we get to the next question, I want to mention the giveaway again. I posted the instructions for that in the chat. If you want to post on LinkedIn, talk about your experience on the webinar, and then tag Tim, tag Leader Factor, and put the hashtag psychological safety. We'll select a random winner, and they will get a 30-minute live virtual session with their team and Tim to go over the 4 stages model, and then we'll give away 10 free books. So the next question is from Carolyn. Who is the owner of promoting psychological safety in an organization? Is it HR? Is it the leaders? Is it the managers?
That's a great question. It's actually every single person in the organization, but if you possess positional power, then you have an even bigger stewardship, right? But it can't be HR. That'll never work. HR cannot be the steward of the culture. Everyone has a role to play there, right? We all have a role to play. Even individual contributors are participating in the creation of psychological safety. Psychological safety is dynamic and it's delicate, and the job is never done. That's why we measure it on an ongoing basis, because it is the central bellwether for the overall health of a culture. It's the most accurate indicator of the health of the culture, of the vibrancy of the culture, of the ability of the culture to be, number one, inclusive, and number two, innovative. And so we all have a role to play, but if you're in a formal managerial role, let alone in an executive role, then you have an even bigger stewardship to model psychological safety and make sure that you're holding others accountable to do the same thing. But to say that it's HR's job, that'll never work. You'll have dysfunction forever. The executives have to begin the stewardship because they set the tone, they create the overall vibe. But then at the team level, this is where we have microcultures. The leader of the team is the most important factor in culture formation. So every team leader has a profoundly important role in creating psychological safety. So it's something that we all share. Isn't that true?
It certainly is. Okay, next question. Creating a culturally flat organization is a great idea. What are your suggestions for building while working remotely? How do you be a cultural architect while working remotely? The nuances are a little bit different than face-to-face.
That's a fantastic question. So first of all, check out my Harvard Business Review article on that. That will probably be helpful to you. And then what I would say is that in a distributed, remote, virtual environment, we're having to shift in some really fundamental ways. So I'll give you an example of the communication pattern that you should be using. The communication pattern needs to be frequent and brief. A best practice is to check in with your people twice a day, at least once in the morning and once in the afternoon. Very brief, but it's the consistency and the frequency that maintains that sense of community in a virtual environment. If your communication pattern is infrequent and long, that's much more dangerous than frequent and brief. So that's just one best practice. The other thing that I would suggest that you do is download our behavioral guide for very concrete behavioral recommendations. And you can do that for free. It's a free, very robust resource, free download. So you can go to the website and grab that. And that will help you because it's very practical.
Another thing, we've got a few comments in the chat. So our website is leaderfactor.com and our LinkedIn is Leader Factor. We're Leader Factor on pretty much all socials. So if you're enjoying this content and you want something like the behavioral guide, go give us a follow on LinkedIn, and we post that type of stuff on there. So next question is from Kimberly. I personally really like this one. How do you see this process in education? I believe teacher development is too limited. Since the leader, yeah, we can all agree there.
Wow.
Since the leader is the linchpin, I think it must begin training with administration and district leaders. What do you think about that, Tim?
Yeah, let's jump into that. So in the book, I give a case study of a high school calculus teacher who is probably the best high school calculus teacher, at least in the United States. He is incredible. And what he does in his classroom, I spent hours in his classroom observing the classroom, interviewing him, interviewing some of the students. What he does is he creates a norm in his classroom where he separates fear from failure and mistakes. He takes those apart. Now, those often go together in organizations, don't they? We've all experienced that. If we make a mistake or if we fail, there's fear that comes with that. But those two things don't necessarily go together. So he pulls them apart. And in his classroom, he creates an environment where students jump in because the vulnerability is rewarded. It's not punished. They're never harshly criticized. They're never embarrassed. They're never marginalized when they make a mistake or fail. So he transforms the culture and he creates psychological safety at a very high level. Well, what does that do for students? It accelerates their growth and development because, as we all know, the learning process is both intellectual and emotional. You cannot separate the two. Every 26 seconds in the United States, a student drops out of high school. Well, why does that happen? That's a tragedy. The research shows it's not because the students can't do the work. Barring a legitimate learning disability, they can do the work. The problem is they don't have the support, they don't feel the encouragement, they lose confidence, they call it quits. That's what happens. You can never separate the intellectual and the emotional in the learning process. They are interwoven. And so the successful teacher, the successful leader, the successful boss, the successful mentor, the successful coach is nurturing both sides of that because he or she understands the reality of the learning process. Are we paying enough attention to this in our educational systems and let alone our organizations? No, we're not. We're not doing that. And we need to. We need to focus on that. We need to create nurturing environments where is there still accountability? Sure, there's accountability. Accountability never leaves. But if there's any fear, it's self-inflicted because I didn't perform. It doesn't come from the organization. It's not a manufactured level of fear, right? Based on misbehaving teachers or coaches or leaders, because that's unacceptable. And by the way, so you may want to listen to the other webinars because we go into some more depth on this issue, but I'm pretty passionate about that topic. So thanks for asking about it.
That's a great question. And when we're talking about education, I think that the intellectual friction, social friction piece is so interesting. And those norms that children are socialized, even in grade school and primary school, those can have long lasting effects. It's so important.
Yeah. When was the last time you said to a student or one of your employees, you absolutely got it wrong. It was a disaster. Congratulations. Fantastic, fantastic effort, fantastic thinking, fantastic attempt. This is what we want. Yeah. So we encourage the effort. We encourage the curiosity. We encourage the attempts at trying to get it right. We encourage the experimentation and the discovery process. You got it wrong. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So let me just end with this. So this really summarizes what the learning process is all about. Failure is not the exception. It's the expectation. And isn't that real? I've heard some bosses even say, we don't make mistakes around here. We don't make mistakes around here? I'm sorry. Let me invite you back to reality. That's not how organizations work. That's not how human beings work. And yet we have leaders that go around with that kind of propaganda. That's not how institutions or humans work. It's just not.
Excellent. So I want to do just one last question. We got a couple minutes left. So
Yeah.
this one, as a leader, how long do we wait for team members to come out of their comfort zone and be okay with making mistakes? People come to teams with their thought patterns and may not want to make mistakes, even when the organization said they can try, experiment, and learn via mistakes.
That's true. So let me talk about private learning and public learning. Depending on the disposition and the temperament of the individual, he or she will learn in a different way. Some people love to learn publicly, in collaboration, in dialogue. They love it. They gain energy in the process, and this is how they process. They learn out loud. They learn verbally. They learn in conversation, and they learn publicly, and they're fine with it. Others don't. Others like to learn privately or maybe one-on-one, and they're very inhibited in a public setting. So number one, it's your job to understand their learning disposition. What is their learning disposition? And then number two, to draw them out, to encourage them, to allow them to have some experiences that are successful, where you can point it out and you can say, wonderful job. So you tried this didn't work, but this did work. But what I want to compliment you about is the process and the effort. And so it's part of the coaching process to draw people out, never to punish their vulnerability, but to reward their vulnerability, because sometimes they're going to make progress very, very slowly. And you will be the repository of their confidence until they can get their own. They don't have it initially, and it's going to take time. That's a matter of judgment by individual, right?
Excellent. All right, everyone. Thank you so much again for your participation. We always love coming together and doing these webinars with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. And we invite you to interact with us even more on social. On LinkedIn, you can go and search Leader Factor and follow us. We're posting pretty frequently there. We're posting these videos on YouTube, so you can follow us there. And as far as housekeeping, again, we will be sending a recording to all of you of this webinar. And in that email, I think we'll go ahead and also include some of the resources that we've talked about today. They're really valuable. The HBR article, the behavioral guide, we'll go ahead and curate that stuff so you have it all in one place and get it sent to you. So with that, we'll sign off. We hope that everyone has a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Thanks everybody.
Take care.